Okay, hello everyone. So this is some support for MD7006 assessment 2. So essentially what I want to do is similar to as I did for assessment 1. I just want to give you a bit of extra information, kind of talk you through the assessment brief, and make sure you understand kind of exactly what's expected of you with this assignment. This is assessment 2, so this is the literature review. So if you look at the assessment brief on the module space, you'll see the key sentences. You are required to produce a literature review of therapeutic interventions relevant to a single human pathology. So essentially what you need to do is pick a single human pathology and identify the therapeutic interventions that are either currently used or have been used or are in development, and review them to the best of your ability. Obviously the main focus is going to be the therapeutic interventions that are currently used, so the current options that are there. And in terms of the pathology that you can pick, the way I've worded it in the brief is the pathology should be relevant to the module. That's pretty vague, and I appreciate that that's pretty vague. However, I think it's specific enough to say that you should pick a pathology that is related to either clinical immunology or infectious disease, so microbial pathogenesis. At the conclusion of the module, you should have a very clear understanding of what that entails. A lot of the lectures will be giving you examples of topics you could talk about. If you're unsure about whether or not a pathology is appropriate, just ask me, just shoot me an email, and I'm happy to answer that. Again, the scope is quite broad there. I'm fairly open-minded, but it does have to be somewhere within. It has to be related to clinical immunology or microbial pathogenesis. So by microbial pathogenesis, I mean an infectious disease. So just bear that in mind, because again, if you pick a pathology that's outside of this region, so you haven't exactly done what you've been asked to do, so that's going to be a problem when we're marking it. So in terms of the review itself, you should have experience of writing reviews at this point. So the kind of key idea of what a literature review is should already be in your head. If it's not, then please speak to me, and I'll put up some resources. I'm kind of operating on the assumption that you understand the difference between primary and secondary literature, and that you understand that a literature review is a secondary piece of literature. So it's a piece of secondary research, and you're basically reviewing the primary research. If what I just said doesn't make sense, just let me know, and I'll put up some resources to make it clear. Essentially, what you need to do is look for all the primary research papers you can find discussing the therapeutic interventions used or being developed or past used to target your chosen pathology, and then you need to do a review of that literature. The review needs to be critical. I don't just want you to tell me to describe all these different techniques. I don't want you to just tell me what they are. That's not valuable. That's not what a literature review is. A literature review is meant to add something. It's meant to have some value, and the value comes from your ability to critically analyze these different therapeutic techniques. The idea is that an individual who is interested in your chosen pathology can read your literature review, and then at the conclusion of the review have a really good solid idea of the strengths and the weaknesses of the different potential therapeutic interventions, and also have an idea of where the field is heading. So have an idea of any potential future therapeutic interventions that are under development, any potential problems with that development, any kind of barriers and things like that. So again, that's what a literature review is. You're going to be critically analysing these papers and pulling out the key bits of information If, say, I wanted to go and learn, so imagine I didn't know anything about, say, malaria, and then I wanted to learn about the therapeutic interventions currently used for malaria. I can sit there and I can read, 50 research papers that have been put out in the last year. That's going to take a lot of time. A lot of medical doctors, which I'm not, but a lot of medical doctors won't have the time to do that. And this is one of the reasons why we have literature reviews, because then what a doctor can do is read the literature review instead. And they're getting all the key bits of information, they're getting all the critical analysis, but they don't have to wade through dozens and dozens of papers, of the primary papers, so they can just read the literature review instead. I mentioned then, and there'd be so many papers published in the past year. That's something that needs to be addressed as well. So one question a lot of students have is, how recent do the papers have to be? How old is too old? There's no easy answer to that question. It's not as simple as, if a paper is published in the last 2 years, then you automatically include it. It's a lot more nuanced than that. Depending on the pathology you've chosen, there may be more papers published or less papers published. Again, the frequency of papers, sometimes for some pathologies, there's papers coming out every month. For some, that's definitely not happening. It's a lot slower. So it depends on context. It also depends on the papers themselves. So if one of the therapeutic interventions you're talking about the efficacy of, for example, if it's been researched since the 90s, and there's been a steady stream of papers, you have to pick which of those studies are most relevant and which are most reliable. You don't necessarily have to include all these studies, and it's most likely that the most recent papers are going to be the most reliable, or at least are going to be the most relevant. So there's not a cutoff where you can't include older papers anymore. A lot of students think that is the case. They think it's automatically a bad thing to include a paper that's 20 years old. That's not always the case. For example, if you're talking about, I don't know, so let's just say HIV, and you're talking about the first therapeutic interventions that were used for HIV, so drugs like AZT. These were first used over 20 years ago. So if you want to look at the first studies that came out, and if you want to refer to the original efficacy that was found for these drugs, you have to reference these papers that are that old. So that's absolutely fine, because you're going back to the primary literature, so there's not a problem there. It says in the assessment brief here that it's expected you will demonstrate an ability to access and interpret primary literature, which is what we just said, and to discuss this literature critically, which what we've just said again, and in an intelligent and insightful way. This insightfulness is super important. So insightful, you should be adding something to it. You should be applying your intelligence, and you should be showing that you understand the papers and the field, all the context, in a nuanced way. When we talk about critical evaluation, a lot of the times we use the example of papers reporting a study that has too few participants or too many participants, right? That's a way to critically analyze a study. It's very superficial, however. It's not very nuanced. It's not very insightful. If you're able to look at these papers and identify really kind of novel critical points, if you're able to identify issues or strengths that are novel, that other people might not have necessarily noticed, and that it takes kind of intelligence and a really deep understanding to notice, then that's great. Those are the submissions that get the really, really high marks. Obviously, there's a lot of other elements necessary, but that's a really good thing you can include. So again, the more insightful, the better. This is a 3,000 word assignment, so it's a fairly long literature review, and it's worth most of the grade for the module. So, but the reason why it's set that way is because I want that level of depth. I want you to have the opportunity to go into quite a lot of detail, and that's what hopefully you can do in 3,000 words. you can really kind of delve deep into the literature. You have the opportunity to kind of show off in a way and to really explore ideas and to really show your ability to analyze these papers intelligently and in an insightful way. Submission deadline, June 27th, 2 p.m. As always, please don't miss the deadline. It's rarely ever worth it. It's almost always worth if you just submit it latest, say, an hour or two before the deadline. All the time we'll have assignments that are just submitted like a minute over or even 30 seconds over, and that's a late submission, so there's a penalty with that. And it's a shame, and sometimes it's because students have been trying to rush and submit last minute. Just avoid that stress, just get it done in advance. I know you have a million other things to do, but just try and get it submitted at least a couple of hours in advance. That's always a good idea. In terms of structure and things like that and what elements need to be included, I don't need an abstract, don't need to include an abstract. Some modules you'll be asked for an abstract for literature review. I don't need one, I don't mind about that. So there does, however, need to be a background or an introduction, and this background or introduction, whatever you call it, is essentially providing the necessary background information for the reader to understand the rest of the study. So if your if your literature review is talking about therapeutic interventions targeting malaria, then in your background you need to be talking about what malaria is, what causes it, the pathogenesis, epidemiology. These are all the kind of things you need to be discussing. After the background, the introduction, you're going to go into the discussion itself. So the discussion is going to be the core kind of meat, if you like, of the literature review. It's going to be the largest section by far. It's going to be where you actually review the papers. Essentially, what the best way to structure it is to break the discussion up into subsections, and as you're talking about therapeutic interventions, you can design these subsections to look at different types of therapeutic interventions. So you can have one subsection where you talk about, say, gene therapies, one where you talk about vaccines, one where you talk about drug-based interventions. This isn't going to be 100% applicable to your chosen pathology, but these are ideas of how you can structure the discussion. A problem students have with the discussion is it's basically this vast chunk of the literature review. It can therefore often lose focus, it can lack a sense of flow, it can lack a sense of direction, and one way to mitigate this problem is to split it up into these subsections. Usually that's pretty effective. After the discussion, you'll have the conclusion. You should know what a conclusion is by now, really. You're just wrapping everything together in a concise, clear way. The crucial inclusion needs to be future work. So this can be in the conclusion or it can be included in the discussion. You basically need to make specific, intelligent and insightful suggestions for future work. So this is also a purpose of a literature review. Someone reading the literature review should take away ideas that can influence their research. They need to that there should be ideas there that you've presented that are novel, that are insightful, that are new, that the person has never heard before. So again, calls for future work need to be included. They need to be specific, they need to be detailed, and they need to be justified. It doesn't matter whether they're in the conclusion or in the discussion. Sometimes they're in the conclusion and it works really well. Sometimes they're kind of peppered throughout the discussion, and then there's quite a few towards the end. That's also a nice way of doing it. But either way, they need to be included. So those are the key sections, and obviously the reference list at the very end. So hopefully that's been useful information. If you have any other questions that you think I haven't answered, or you just want any clarifications or guidance, feel free to just shoot me an email. Always happy to email back. Thank you.